and welcome to this workshop on connecting the enterprise using MCP servers from Copilot Studio. My name is Kent Weir. I'm a Principal Product Manager at Microsoft. So a little bit more about myself. I've spent most of my career working on integration and automation. Previously, I was a product manager on the Microsoft Flow team on kind of the early days of that product. From there, I also spent some time as a program manager lead on the Power Platform Customer Advisory team. So working specifically on RPA and Power Virtual Agents implementations. I do have an active YouTube channel, so that's likely where you're watching this. And also I've introduced a new blog called theagentfrontier.com. Feel free to add me on LinkedIn if you're watching this content. Also, I would say that I've made this workshop free, so if you want to like, subscribe, share this with friends and colleagues, please go ahead and do so. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the agenda. So we're going to start with a little bit of a Logic Apps introduction, just knowing that some of the people that are watching this may not have used Logic Apps or may not be very familiar with it, so we'll just do a brief intro and we'll actually show a demo of that as well. Then we're going to get more into the core content. We're going to talk about MCP servers. We're going to talk about how you can build an MCP server from API Center, and what's important about this is we will be able to then use that later on from Copilot Studio. I thought it would also be interesting to show a similar experience inside of Microsoft Foundry. Since I know a lot of people these days, they're building in Copilot Studio, they're also building in Microsoft Foundry, so I thought that would be of interest as well. The next thing is, under the hood, when we go ahead and use these experiences to build MCP servers, there's some changes that we make in the underlying Logic apps that support these MCP servers. I thought it'd be interesting to do a deeper dive, look under the hood and see what's going on. How does all of this stuff work from that perspective? Then we're going to get into consuming Logic Apps MCP servers from Copilot Studio, and then we're also going to talk a little bit about other MCP server options from Copilot Studio. And last but not least, I will leave you with some additional resources and a call to action. Okay, so let's get into Logic Apps Introduction. So Logic Apps is a cloud-based integration and automation platform. It's been around for quite some time. The first sort of iteration of it was Logic Apps Consumptions, which launched in 2016. We currently have 3 different deployment modes. So we have Consumption, Standard, and Hybrid. Now, you might be familiar, if you're coming from the Power Platform side, with Consumption. That is the one that looks and feels a lot like Cloud Flows inside of Power Automate. There's a lot of history and lineage there as well. But Standard is typically the version that we are promoting when it comes to enterprise readiness, just because we offer some additional capabilities there. And we're going to talk more about that today. And what we use today is all based upon Logic Apps Standard. And then we also have Hybrid, and this is one of our more recent SKUs. And this allows you to go ahead and run your Logic App workloads on customer managed infrastructure. So this means you can actually run this on premises on your own Kubernetes cluster that is connected to Azure through Azure Arc, but the local runtime is available to you. You've got local compute, local storage, local networking as well. Now, in order to build Logic App solutions or workflows, you do use a drag and drop visual designer. Now, we do provide custom code extensibility, so this would be one of those differences between Power Automate and ourselves, and you can go ahead and manage code in, say, C#.NET. We also support some additional scripting languages as well. You can do things like Python and JavaScript and PowerShell as well. Now, in where you build these workflows, that can be in the Azure portal through a web browser, or can also be through VS Code. Now, I mentioned before that we do offer an enterprise-ready SKU, and what do I mean by that is enterprise customers are usually looking for a predictable execution, and that comes by having dedicated compute. Same thing with storage, right? You don't want to be throttled because you've got a noisy neighbor who has a burst in traffic. You want more control over your performance profile, and that storage piece is actually a pretty big part of that. We also want networking with built-in scalability. So networking meaning, hey, I've got resources that might be on premises or in other sort of cloud subscriptions, and I want to be able to access those over a private network as opposed to the public internet, and those are options available in our Logic Apps Standard and Hybrid SKUs. And then also scalability. Sometimes you do have these workloads that can be quite bursty, and you want to avoid those inconvenient 429 errors when you've tried to make too many requests. And we offer that ability to have scalability so you can scale your footprint out dynamically, address your emerging load needs, and then after the fact compress and go back to sort of your base configuration. And of course, only paying for what you're using. So you're not having to pay for peak or commit for peak. It's really dynamic from that perspective. Now, much like a lot of other platforms, we've embraced agentic, and we've added capabilities starting in 2024 with continued investments in 2025 and 2026, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in an upcoming slide. All right, so here's just a little bit more information about those SKUs. So I mentioned Logic Apps Consumption. It is a multi-tenant platform, so you're sharing compute with other customers. Obviously, we segregate your data access and keep you safe, and there's no crossover, but the compute is shared. And we do offer 1,400 plus managed connectors. These are what's called Azure Managed Connectors. These are endpoints that are hosted in the cloud behind API management, and that's where you see some of those throttling and those policies introduced. But that's where you're going to connect to a lot of your popular SaaS systems like ServiceNow, Salesforce, Dataverse, etc. And it is important to note, even though it is a multi-tenant service, that you do see resources deployed in your customer tenant. So you log into Azure, you will see your Logic App consumption there. And that will allow you to do things like managed identity if you wish, so you can actually then use Logic Apps and additional security mechanisms to connect to your services. Now, if we shift over to Logic Apps Standard, I talked about this before, it's a single tenant platform where you do have that managed infrastructure, that isolated infrastructure that you have control over. Now, we still offer you those 1,400 plus managed connectors. Those are still available for your use, but we also provide around 50 built-in connectors. Now, what's different about these connectors is these are typically your high throughput connectors that run in your dedicated compute, which means you've got more control from a scalability perspective. We don't impose throttles on those connectors because it's your compute, you're already paying for it. And if you have bursty workloads, well, you're going to burst and scale, and you'll scale the platform along with it. And so that also creates opportunities for being able to connect to local networks. So you can go ahead and connect from your Logic App instance to, say, your on-premises SQL Server or SAP Server without any additional gateways like on-premise data gateways, VNet gateways, things like that. You've just got that direct connection through your VNet, and this simplifies a lot of things. We also support those additional security models like managed identity. We've got the scalable compute I mentioned, and then also the local code functions. So this is kind of interesting. There's going to be scenarios where you want that custom code extensibility. Sometimes people today go ahead and call an Azure function, which is cool, but it does add some complexity, right? Now you've got another runtime to manage, another service to pay for, another deployment that you have to take care of. Sometimes it might make more sense to have that all inside of the Logic App. So we actually allow you to write local functions. Now, it's based on the functions programming model. So it really is a quote-unquote Azure function, but it runs locally inside of your compute, so you don't have to pay twice, and you don't have to deploy twice because you deploy it with your Logic App project itself. Pretty cool. The hybrid side of things, customer managed infrastructure, you want more control, maybe you've got some industry-specific requirements, and this allows you to address those needs. Now, it is semi-connected to Azure for the control plane. So what does that mean? It means like when your workflows are running, they're all running locally. All of the telemetry and the persistence is stored locally in a local SQL server. But the manageability of this is taking place through the Azure portal. So there's basically a bridge that takes place where you can go to the Azure portal, you can see your resources there, you can enable, disable, check out your run history, and calls are being made through the Azure Arc infrastructure in order to connect down to your local solution. So that might be of interest for some use cases, and we definitely see it in the areas of some industry and data sovereignty needs. That's where customers are typically using that offering. All right, so let's just talk briefly about some designers. On the left-hand side, we see the Azure portal. You can see, if you've used Power Automate, this probably looks quite similar. there's some shared assets here. We've shared some code. We've shared some design patterns. And so that where it might look, quite familiar, which is great. So it means that you can get started with this quite easily. This is a picture of our sort of latest, view or latest designer that's currently in preview, where we have draft and the ability to publish our configurations. And this is something that's quite new from that perspective. Now, we also offer Visual Studio Code. So maybe you are a pro developer, maybe you do sort of feel more comfortable working in a sort of disconnected mode, where you can go ahead and author these workflows in VS Code. You can do local testing, write unit tests. Maybe you've got some of those local code functions that you want to go ahead and author. That's where you can go ahead and use VS Code, still use the designer, still use your connections, and then we'll also help you generate your CI/CD deployment packages that you can then go ahead and check into, say, Azure DevOps, and then have your CI/CD processes all in place as well. The choice is yours. Either one will get you to the place where you want to go. Now, just wanted to talk a little bit about connectors. So I talked about the Azure or managed connectors, and these are available in all SKUs, right? So whether it's consumption, standard, or even hybrid, these do run in the cloud, and these are essentially those open API, metadata sitting on top of the underlying services itself. So if you've seen Power Automate, you're going to have a lot of overlap here. A lot of those are the same connectors, just available in multiple platforms, both Power Platform and Logic Apps. Now, when we think about the built-in, this is where we get into the hybrid and the standard SKUs. And this is where we've got sort of some differentiation here. These are running in your local compute. So as a result, we allow you for more throughput. So a lot of the characteristics here of these connectors is they typically tend to be high throughput. So things like Service Bus, right, where you've got a lot of messages going back and forth. HTTP, calling a custom API, the ability to call Azure Functions, Azure API Management. So you want to have some inline code, right? So, that's always a concern when you have a public service, is how do we avoid customers from doing stuff that could impact others? Well, guess what? It's in your local compute. You can go ahead and write that inline code. We also have some additional messaging connectors for Kafka, and we've got Event Grid and Event Hubs, and your storage and file storage and Cosmos DB. So a lot of these kind of enterprise connectors that you would love to have more isolation around. Oftentimes these are the connectors that are going to be protected or need to connect through a VNet, and that's also going to be enabled through this model. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about agentic capabilities. So something we've introduced recently is called Agent Loop. And this allows you to go ahead and build an agentic business process inside of Azure Logic Apps. This is going to allow you to do this in a conversational or an autonomous manner. So conversation meaning I get to chat with the solution, or autonomous meaning, hey, there's a trigger, there's an event that fires in some system, I'm going to go kick off the workflow. In this case, what we're seeing here is an autonomous use case where we've got a database connector that's listening for an add or modify or delete event, and then it'll kick off the process. Now, the agent loop itself is really an action, so you can kind of think of it a little bit like a connector, and as part of connectors, we naturally have connections. And so what's happening here is that this generate quote agent loop action is going to create a connection to our Azure OpenAI instance where we have a deployment of ChatGPT 5. Now, we establish that connection, and the next thing we need to do when building agentic solutions is we need to provide a prompt or instructions. And that's what we're going to do here. Say, you are an agent who will help generate and validate quotes. So there's our prompt. From there, we have tools. And so these tools can go ahead and be connector actions. They can be custom code. They can be APIs. They can also be workflows. And these are going to allow us to dynamically and loosely couple the calling of these tools from the implementation. And we're going to actually leverage AI and the large language model based upon the prompts and the objectives that are set forth for that particular component to go ahead and call these tools in the right order. So this is kind of the mix of deterministic steps mixed with agentic or probabilistic steps and coming together in a single experience. All right, so I thought it would be just good and useful to go ahead and just show a demo of this. I know this isn't necessarily related to MCP, but I thought this would be interesting for folks as you sort of think about your agentic business processes and how you might want to go ahead and solve it. So this one's a little bit more involved, and it's related to a wealth management solution. So let me just sort of dive into this a little bit more. So we have a wealth manager. In this case, it's Tom, and Tom is, working with customers. He wants to serve them and help them with their retirement investments and things like that. So we've got a customer named Jordan Avery, and so Jordan might be on a call, with Tom and saying, hey, I'd like to be able to sort of meet with you and review my portfolio. And Tom needs to go ahead and get set up and get prepared for all of that. So he's going to use an agent, and in this case, a conversational agent, to go ahead and basically help him provide great service for his customer, Jordan. And there's a series of tools that are going to be used, including, calendar, checking our Outlook calendar, sending Outlook emails, generating pre-briefing documents. Naturally, the customer information stored in a CRM, in this case, Salesforce. We've got customer portfolio information, and we may also want to go ahead and extract knowledge about what's going on with their portfolio and the companies that he has in his portfolio. So we're going to actually use a tool to go ahead and help us with that. So let's go ahead, let's see a demo, and from there we'll get into the MCP content after that. All right, so let's start in the Logic Apps Designer. Now here I've gone ahead and created a workflow, and this workflow is going to support a conversational agent. So what we can do is we can head over to the workflows area. We can click on create. We've got templates, plus we've got just the create new experience. And then here we can kind of choose, do we want to have an autonomous agent, a conversational agent, a stateful deterministic workflow, or a stateless deterministic workflow. And I went ahead and selected the conversational one. So let's just exit out here, and then let's open up our sort of solution that's already been built. All right, so let's take a closer look, and then we'll run this. So it starts off, we've got an A2A trigger, and this supports the A2A protocol naturally. And this allows you to have a conversational agent, but this also opens the door for other agent-to-agent solutions as well, where you want to leverage that protocol. From there, we've got our agent loop action. And so this kind of looks and feels a little bit like a connector, but what's interesting is that behind the scenes there's a whole lot more. So this allows us to go ahead and create a connection to a large language model. Now in this case, I've got a lot of different models that are available to me, and these would be Azure OpenAI models, and I've just chosen GPT-4.1. It meets my needs and is pretty quick. And then what we have the opportunity to provide is instructions for agents. So this would basically be our system prompt, and we're able to go ahead and describe what we want this agent to go ahead and do. And so what we're saying is that at the beginning of every interaction, retrieve and review the standard operating procedures from the business process tool, and then do not process any client or wealth manager requests before confirming that the the standard operating procedures have been obtained. Then use the SOP to validate actions during the session, and if the SOP has not been retrieved, pause further steps until you do it. And then just reinforcing the importance of the SOP and making sure that that actually is used. And so that's how we can go ahead and connect to our large language model and provide instructions. Now, back to that standard operating procedures, we do have a tool that will go ahead and get the details for us. And so here, this tool shows up over here. We have a Word document that is actually shown inside of SharePoint, or I guess hosted inside of SharePoint, and we're going to go retrieve it. And then what we're going to do is use a parse a document action. So this is one of our AI operations that actually helps you go ahead and basically extract kind of the key information. If we think about a Word document, there's a whole bunch of binary and rich metadata that we don't need. We just want to focus more on the content, so that's what it's going to allow us to do. Now I've opened up this Word document just to give you a sense of what's included in here, right? So this is kind of an important concept, and I really sort of like to emphasize this, is that if you think about what you're building, it is aligned to some sort of business process. So there's some sort of business process that you're trying to enhance or automate or enable, and you want to make sure that that business process is followed. And so here we've just outlined the business process in natural language, what we expect this solution to go do. Like, so we want to support a wealth manager and how they manage customer interactions. And so as a result, we're saying that there could be actions, and these kind of translate to tools in many ways, to go ahead and check a calendar for availability, book a meeting, access a customer portfolio and calculate their net worth, looking for any recent news for a particular stock symbol, building a pre-meeting briefing document with some instructions, both functional and non-functional as well, calculating their portfolio, accessing previous meeting notes, accessing customer demographic information, retrieving the last meeting transcript, summarizing a meeting transcript. So these are all operations that we want to go ahead and enable. And so what that does is that translates to tools here. So if we go from right to left, we can go ahead and retrieve previous meeting notes from Salesforce. We can go ahead and create a Salesforce opportunity with meeting notes. We can get previous meeting transcripts. This is going to call a child workflow, which we'll go call a graph API. We can go generate a Word document, that pre-briefing document, and go ahead and send that out and send a link to our wealth manager with the document. We can go get news. In this case, we're querying the Google search API, and we're going to parse news and make that available. We're going to get customer portfolio information. We'll get customer details, both account and contact information. We'll book a meeting with Teams. We'll get the wealth manager's email address, and we'll also go ahead and get find meeting times. Now, one thing just to highlight here is you might be asking, okay, well, great, what account do these actions run underneath? And we have introduced a concept called on behalf of, which allows specific actions to run under the context of the logged in user that's using the agent, that is. And so this is an example of one that we've enabled this for. If we add a connection, you'll see that there's this create as per user connection. And so this will then go ahead, when this is enabled, will prompt the user for consent to go ahead and use their credentials, so that when we're looking to find meeting times, it's in my chat session. I could have a colleague that comes and uses this as well, and it would run in their session. So this is a pretty big deal and pretty important capability to go ahead and unlock. So with that said, let's now go ahead and run this. We can click on our chat link here, and that will open up a chat surface. And what we'll want to do here is just click on a new chat. Now I'm just going to start with something simple and just say, hi, like, what can you help me with? And this is where that standard operating procedures document will come into place, where it's going to be able to say, hey, these are all of the functions that I can go ahead and help you with. Okay, so here it's streamed a response back, and so it's going to outline things that we can do, like checking calendar availability, accessing client portfolio info, etc. Now, just to kind of reinforce the importance of having kind of the business process mapped out, I'm just going to ask, hey, can you go ahead and get me a coffee? And it's saying, no, sorry, I can't do that because that's not part of our standard operating procedures. So once again, we're enforcing a business process through knowledge. Now, in this case, it's knowledge as a tool, but it's knowledge nonetheless. Now let's talk about some more relevant use cases. So let's go ahead and get customer details and portfolio information for one of our customers, Jordan Avery. Now what's going to happen here is that there's going to be multiple tools that are called simultaneously, right? So we actually went ahead and called and we were able to get this information from Salesforce. Now, for some reason, it didn't go ahead and grab the portfolio, but let's just ask for that again. All right, so that looks a little bit better. And here what we can see is that this person has a variety of different equities that they do own, and obviously this is also fictional, but it's coming from an actual table itself. So we've got Microsoft, Meta, AMD, Intel, NVIDIA, and we can see their total portfolio value, the sort of basically the profit loss statement, and now we're being asked, hey, is there any recent news on these holdings? So it feels like NVIDIA always has something going on. So let's go ahead and see if there's any news for NVIDIA. So let's just go ahead and send that out. All right, so this is something where we've got some links. We could go ahead and check out those links, and that's of interest. But let's kind of roll the dice here a little bit, try to make it a little more interesting. And then let's say any news from CES. So CES is the big consumer electronics show that's happening in Las Vegas recently, and so this is something where looks like they made headlines about AI, advanced graphics technology, new GPUs, advancements in automotive AI. Actually, they released an interesting framework for autonomous AI vehicles. So that's kind of interesting, where I was able to go ahead and retrieve that in real time. Now, we want to go ahead and talk to Jordan. Jordan's interested in having a meeting, and naturally we want to go into that being prepared. And so he might be asking about NVIDIA and what's going on with it. Like, is it still something that he should still be a part of? And so let's go ahead and ask for a pre-meeting briefing document that includes this information and any other recommendations for Jordan as well. Now, so this is running in the background. It's basically going to summarize this information. It then went ahead and emailed our wealth manager with this information in a Word document. So let's flip over to email and see if we can find this. All right, so in the email, we can see that we've got a pre-meeting briefing document available. So let's go ahead and let's open this. All right, so it's gone ahead and opened it. It's got a bunch of his demographic information, his holdings, and we've got the NVIDIA news update from CES. So, these are some steps it's suggesting that I, as a wealth manager, can go ahead and include or consider when meeting with Jordan Avery. So the next question is, okay, let's go ahead and set up a time with Jordan so we can go ahead and go over this information. So I will go ahead and see, hey, what does my schedule look like on January 9th? And so here, it's got some openings in my calendar, and so that's great. So we can now go ahead and say, let's go with 8:30 a.m. And now that should go ahead and book that meeting in the calendar. Book with Jordan. And once again, it's going to go leverage that information from Salesforce about Jordan's contact information, including his email address. So here we've got a meeting that has been booked. Let's just go ahead and double check on that. All right, didn't want to show my entire calendar, but here we go. We could see that we've got that meeting that's booked, including the information that we should focus on. So that's great. All right, so you can imagine we've had a meeting with Jordan, and this meeting's gone well, and we naturally want to go ahead and get the summary of this particular meeting. Now, obviously, this meeting is fictional, but the idea, we can go ahead and retrieve meeting transcripts from the Graph API. So what I've got is a meeting that's previously took place where I recorded a conversation and we were able to basically have that transcript. So that's what's going to be retrieved here. So it's going to go ahead and get the latest transcript from that meeting, and you can kind of see in the Teams format kind of all of the exchanges that were going back and forth. So that's great, but we want this for long-term usage. So if there was any sort of audit or any discrepancies in the future, we want to make sure that this is available to us. We also want to make sure that the next time we talk to Jordan, we can also review our notes from this interaction and make sure that I've gone ahead and followed up on any sort of commitments that I may have made. So let's just go ahead and update Salesforce with this information. And so this will go call that Salesforce tool, and it should create a new opportunity for us. So, okay, so let's go ahead and head over to Salesforce. So let's refresh. So this is the account for Jordan Avery. And then we should also have a contact that's linked to it, so we can see that's his email address and etc. And then we've got the notes, right? So here we did a portfolio review with NVIDIA and the CES update discussion. And basically we've got the meeting transcripts and summary that is available here as well. And we could then go ahead and review this in the future and basically go ahead and be able to sort of have a better conversation with him in the future itself. So I guess one more thing just to talk about is obviously we've talked a little bit about run history, or we will going to talk a little bit about run history. This is another sort of example of kind of the importance of that traceability. So if we go into the run history, what we can see is a replay of that entire conversation. And we can see all of the tools being called and all of the inputs, outputs that we would go ahead and expect to see. Certainly if you're familiar with Power Automate, this will be a familiar experience. So we can see full traceability, inputs, outputs, what the user said, what the agent responded back with, and we've got a very complete picture. We also have another view of this. This is the task timeline. This is kind of why we call it agent loop, is because it is this loop in the sense that we are looping and doing multiple turns. So for each of these tasks, you can kind of think of that as a turn, and we can see exactly what were the tools that were called for that specific turn and basically get more information about them as needed. Okay, so when we think about agentic capabilities in Logic Apps, it's not just about agent loop. There's some other core capabilities that we'll chat about here now. So let's start with one, Python code interpreter. So this is actually pretty cool. You can actually go ahead and provide some data, provide a prompt of what you would like the code interpreter to do. It'll dynamically go ahead and author the Python code and then go ahead and execute that code against the data set that you provide. Super powerful tool, easy to use, and you don't have to be a Python code expert to actually leverage it. So pretty awesome. That's relatively new in the platform. Next up, let's talk about RAG. So the ability to go ahead and ingest and retrieve data, and have that be able to be semantically searched is naturally a pretty popular use case. This works really well if you think about Logic Apps subscribing to different data events, like new file added, file updated, then the ability to go ahead and index that data in a vector DB, and then be able to leverage that vector DB to go ahead and do retrievals on top of it. So this can kind of be used in conjunction with agent loop, or maybe you have a separate ingestion process, but then agent loop can actually take advantage of the retrieval side of things and actually have knowledge as a tool. We also have some AI operations. These are built-in operations that help you just deal with things you typically need to deal with within agentic solutions. So more specifically, the ability to parse data, parse a document, chunk a document, especially in those RAG situations. We also have support for document intelligence. So this is just taking advantage of capabilities in Azure through a connector that allows us to go ahead and say scrape a PDF and to be able to use that data downstream as we automate additional systems. We also have a lot of Microsoft Foundry integrations. So we're going to see one of them in this particular session around tool calling and the tool catalog. And so that's big. We've also integrated with the Foundry control plane as well. We also have an agent service connector where we can go ahead and kick off an agent in Foundry as well. So very much bi-directional integration from that perspective. And then, MCP servers, what we're all here to sort of learn about is the ability to use Logic Apps and our connectors to dynamically go ahead and build an MCP server that can be called from any agent surface that supports MCP. And certainly that would include Copilot Studio and Microsoft Foundry. So let's go ahead, let's get deeper into MCP servers. Let's go. All right, so if you're not overly familiar with MCP, let's just talk a little bit about it. So it is an open protocol that enables seamless integration between a large language model application or agent and your tools and data sources. So we've talked about the 1400 connectors. That is a real enabler here where we can use those connectors to talk to APIs, file systems, databases, AI models, and much more. And we can expose those through the MCP protocol and being able to sort of leverage those existing investments. Now, when we think about leveraging Logic Apps and Azure Integration Services, including API Center, customers can really create these composable architectures and plug and play these different components and use them across their enterprise. And that open protocol of MCP is a big enabler from that perspective. Now, one of the earlier sort of stumbling blocks with the Model Context Protocol more broadly, industry-wide, was security. There was sort of a lack of sort of unification or consistency there, and we've been able to take advantage of existing constructs inside of Azure and Microsoft, more specifically Entra ID, where we can go ahead and use EasyAuth to simplify and impose consistency from an authentication purpose. And so we're going to see that throughout today as well when we get into the demos. And the other thing is that we have multiple experiences where you can go ahead and dynamically build those MCP servers, and we're going to see those all today in action. All right, so what are some of the benefits of using Logic Apps as an MCP server and really providing seamless data access for your agents? So one, I would say, is unifying your enterprise connectivity, providing standard pathways to all your key business data. So it's one of those things, and I guess it kind of ties in a little bit with number two, avoiding duplication, right? So the idea here is maybe you've got your, say, systems like custom APIs, or you've got SAP, or you've got other lines of business systems. You want to provide sort of a common pathway to access those systems. You don't want to have to leave that up to agent developers to go ahead and always have to build those pathways. It becomes redundant, it becomes more difficult to manage, it becomes less consistent from an experience perspective and likely a security perspective if people start doing it their own way, and it just leads to a lot of inefficiencies and sprawl. And so that's what we want to go ahead and do here, is much like you build a custom connector because you want reuse. Well, there's a lot of sort of similarities there with MCP servers. You want to build an MCP server so that you can reuse it across your agentic estate inside of your organization. And I would say there's also opportunities just to leverage existing investments. So, what's kind of interesting from our perspective is you might have a workflow, and that workflow might do very specific things. Step 1, step 2, step 3. And that might be something that sort of is required as part of the process. Like, there might be some steps that are always deterministic, and they need to be deterministic because there's prerequisites. You can leverage those, turn those into an MCP tool, and make them available for your existing solution. So today, maybe you've got a very deterministic tool where there's a web application that calls, a series of workflows behind the scenes to do a bunch of work. Well, now if you're building an agentic experience, you may still want to use those steps. Well, you can go ahead and reuse those. Same things where maybe you've written some custom code and you want to be able to take that functionality and expose that. Maybe you've got existing APIs or even custom connectors, and you want to make sure that your agents can also talk to them, but you want to do that through a common protocol layer, which is the MCP side of things. Now, when we think about the Logic Apps, and this is specific to Logic Apps MCP Server deployment models, we've got 3 modes, and we're going to see all 3 of them here today. One is the API Center integration, and we'll talk a little bit about what API Center is, but this provides an experience for building and discovering MCP servers within your organization. Then we have the Microsoft Foundry Tools Catalog, where if you're using Foundry and you're building a lot of your agentic solutions there, you naturally want to be able to pull all of these different tools from one place. And there's some integration that's been built there. Well, we see Logic Apps show up there in our connectors, but then there's also kind of other first-party and third-party integrations that the Foundry team's built, and it kind of becomes this better together catalog of resources that you can leverage. And then we'll talk about Logic Apps native experience. So maybe you have existing workflows, existing Logic Apps, and you want to enable those for MCP, but you don't want to have to go and republish things. Well, you can also do that out of the box with Logic Apps as well. So just a little bit about the API Center, right? So API Center is an enterprise catalog. It historically was used for APIs, and now it also supports MCP servers. Now, it provides kind of these two modes. As an administrator, you can go ahead and register these resources in your instance, in your catalog. And then from a developer perspective, you can go ahead and discover them through a portal called the API portal, which we will see here today. And so customers can go ahead and dynamically build an MCP server using our Logic App connectors through this integration that we've gone ahead and built with that team. And so, we'll do a full demo here, but it generally involves searching for a specific connector, selecting the operations or the actions that you want to see included as MCP tools, and then there's a series of automation that takes place under the hood where we go ahead and build workflows automatically for you. We go ahead and create app registrations and enable security so that this becomes a very simple experience to go ahead and consume. So just a little bit more info about API Center. It is a central hub that catalogs every API in your organization, regardless of platform or protocol. So obviously this works really well with Microsoft, but it also works for non-Microsoft. And you can see some of that here where Stripe and Box and Atlassian have all built integrations for API Center as well. And kind of the idea here is, we want to avoid that API sprawl, and we want to avoid MCP sprawl, as I mentioned on an earlier slide. This allows you, from an administrative perspective, to oversee what's going on in your environment, but then from a developer perspective, find things so that you don't have to reinvent that wheel. And this also allows you to impose other governance around quality and compliance and enforce design standards. And this really complements, in case you're wondering, complements API management, right? So this is the same team. They offer kind of two offerings. One is API management, which is typically more of your runtime experience and governance. And then this is more, I would call it, of that design time side of things in cataloging and discoverability. And so costs, so this is something to be aware of. There are two tiers. There's a free tier and there's a paid tier. And the free tier is not a trial, which is really nice. It allows you to go ahead and catalog up to 200 APIs or MCP servers before you have to worry about any sort of cost. So a ton of runway just to see if you're getting the value that you would expect from this particular service. And then obviously if you are, then you can go ahead and go ahead and pay and get into sort of the enterprise or the paid tier offering as well. So let's go ahead, let's build an MCP server with API Center. Here's the steps that we're going to go ahead and show. We're going to create an API Center instance. We're going to configure the API portal and assign permissions. We'll build our MCP server, and then we're going to go ahead and test our MCP server. And I'm going to deliberately do this in VS Code, just once again to show you another tool and how this all kind of plays together. So we're going to use VS Code to test our MCP server. Don't worry, later on we're going to take what we've built here and plug it into Copilot Studio. Okay, so here we're going to go ahead and search for API Center. Then we'll go ahead and click on Create. We will select our resource group. We'll provide a name. We'll select the appropriate region. And then here we're definitely going to want to make sure that we choose the free monthly tier. So this will entitle you to up to 200 different APIs and MCP servers without having to sort of pay for any API Center services. So make sure you select free. We'll just go ahead and review and then create. Okay, we'll click on the create button. This should just take a few moments. Okay, our deployment's complete. We can go ahead and navigate to our resource, and here we will find API Center. All right, so now what we want to do is we want to configure the API Center portal, and we can do so by clicking on Settings underneath API Center Portal Preview. So here what we're going to go ahead and do is click on Start Setup, and we will do the quick setup. We will let Azure Portal take care of all of this, and this will be the simplest way forward. Okay, so we've got our settings established for API Center. Now, there is a little bit of a caveat. So we can click on this View API Center Portal, which is cool. The problem is, even if we go ahead and try to sign in here, we're not going to see anything. And the reason for this is that there's some permissions that we do need to establish for any user that wants to access the API portal. Now in the docs here we can see that we need to assign API Center data reader role to people that want to use this particular experience. So I need to go ahead and do that for my user. So I'll head over to the access and identity management control. Now I do have access to do this in this particular tenant. You may need to ask someone to go ahead and do this for you. But here's the Azure API Center data reader. Let's go ahead and select that. Let's select the member. Now I'm going to pause the recording here for a sec. All right, so I've selected my account and we will just go ahead and review and assign. So even though I do have elevated privileges in this subscription, I still have to explicitly have access to that particular role. Otherwise, I still can't access the portal. But let's come back here, and if I refresh, I'll now see this. So this is something that is available just out of the box as a sample, the Swagger Pet Store. So if you can see this, then you know you're in good shape. Now, what's the purpose of this API portal? This is once we've gone through the wizard, we will actually go ahead and see our MCP server show up here. And so we will come back to this portal because we will want to grab the URL from this particular experience so that we can go ahead and use it in other agent experiences. Now, before we go ahead and actually build our MCP server, I just wanted to sort of explain a little bit of the business context behind this. So we've got Salesforce is our CRM in this case, and this could be Dataverse if that's your thing, but just wanted to use this as an example. And we want to build a sales management agent, right? And so the sales management agent is going to do things like updating opportunities, updating contacts, creating contacts, getting accounts, things like that. So we want to build an MCP server that helps with this. And so we're going to go ahead and use the Salesforce connector and the different actions or operations available to us. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create that MCP server and the functionality that allows us to create contacts, get accounts, get opportunities, and update the opportunities. Now, what's interesting is under the hood in the Logic app, and we'll see this as we dive deeper, we're going to see 4 workflows, 1 workflow per action, and we're going to wire them all up so that you can go ahead and do this quite quickly. So let's go ahead, let's see this in action. In order to use our MCP server, we do need a Logic app. Since I don't have one in this subscription, I'm going to go ahead and create one. So let's just go ahead and go through that process right now. Now, in this case, we do want to use Workflow Service Plan. We don't want to use multi-tenant consumption. This won't work. We do want to use the Workflow Service Plan. Then we need to provide some information here. All right, so I've got the name of my Logic app here. I'm going to go ahead and create a Windows plan, an service plan, and we're going to use just the smallest one. This gives us dedicated compute, dedicated memory, and we don't need redundancy for this particular use case. So I'm just going to accept the defaults and then jump to the creation step. Okay, everything's been validated. We are ready to go ahead and deploy. Okay, so the resource has been created. Let's just go ahead and click into it. Now, what we'll see here is that we've got no workflows that have been created, and that's what we would expect. So let's head over back to API Center. So we're in API Center. Let's click on the register button, and now we should have our Logic app that is here. Now, this is pretty important. We do want to provide an MCP server name that is going to make sense for us, because we will leverage this later on when we go ahead and call it. And also, you just in general want descriptive names. It's just as a good practice. All right, so I've provided a name, I've provided a description. Now what we need to do is add a connector. So this is where we're going to browse and see that 1400 connector library that are all what we call Azure managed connectors. Here I'm going to go ahead and select Salesforce, and we will then go ahead and select into this. Now, these are all of the actions that we want to go ahead and obtain or use. So I want to create a record. So we're going to create a contact. Let's see what else here. We want to get account records. So that is of interest to us. We also want to go ahead and get opportunities from Salesforce, and we want to go ahead and update a record as well. So we're going to select those. And then next we need to go ahead and create a connection. So I'm going to sign in with my Salesforce credentials here, and then we will have a connection created inside of our Logic app. Okay, so this is where I'm logging into Salesforce, and after that we will have a connection established for us. Okay, our connection is ready. Now, we're not quite done. We do need to provide some additional configuration. And this is really important, and it's also a reason why you don't just have connectors exposed as MCP servers. Sometimes you might see that, and it's okay for some simpler things like sending emails or posting a message on Teams or something like that. But in this case, we've got a very generic operation here called create record. Now the question is, create record of what? So this is where we need to go ahead and to provide an object type. Here we want to basically connect to Salesforce, and we can see all of the different entities that are available. So in this case, we want to have a contact as our entity type. The next thing we want to do is have information that we pass to this particular MCP server. So we go ahead and define that. Now we've got last name as a mandatory value here, and now we can select other optional values like email, first name, and we'll go with the mailing city. And then the other thing, we want to link it to an account, so we'll also select that as well. Now we've got, these are the 5 different inputs that we're expecting our model to go ahead and pass in. There's one other thing we should always do. This is going to use the default description that comes from the connector metadata. We should update this so that this is more relevant. In this case, we're going to say this tool will create a contact inside of Salesforce. And this becomes really important because when we go ahead and provide instructions to an agent and the LLM, it needs to know what to go do. When we just have create record and a very generic description, it's not going to know what it needs to go ahead and perform. So we'll save changes here. Now I'm going to go ahead and update these other options as well, and I'll pause the recording just so that you don't have to see all of that. Okay, so I've updated all of those. Now we're going to go ahead and click on register. Now we can see here we've got tools that are being created, and then we should also see a registration process taking place. Okay, so we see green lights all around, which is great news. Yeah, so let's go ahead and just quickly explore here. So first off, let's go to the Logic app. Remember, we had an empty workflow folder. So now we've got all of these different workflows, all of these MCP tools that we previously had gone ahead and configured. Now, this is one of the value adds of using that wizard, is that it went ahead and created some workflows and wired them up for us automatically so that we didn't have to do it. Even though these are simple workflows, it still takes time. Some of this is a little bit tedious. Remember those input parameters on the create? So last name, account ID, etc. It did all of that wiring up for us. So it went ahead and generated a schema for our request, plus it has some additional metadata associated with it. So once again, when our agent connects to this MCP server, it will go ahead and understand what are the inputs that are required. The other thing that happens is that those inbound parameters are automatically mapped to our Salesforce action here, and we don't have to wire up any of that. A best practice as well on the response, we're just going to return the entire body. We could update this if we wanted to, but the configure run after is pretty important, where we always want to go ahead and provide a response if it's been successful or timed out or has failed. So even if we get an error message for some reason, we should communicate that back to the model so that it can actually go ahead and try to retry the execution itself. So that's the Logic app configuration. Now, one other thing that's worth exploring, because we're going to need this information a little bit later when we need to connect from Copilot Studio, and that's authentication. So if we've wired up what's called the Easy Auth authentication in this Logic app already, we've created an app registration and called this MCP Logic MCP Server LA, and we've done all of this pre-configuration so that will use OAuth by default. And so we'll see this a little bit later in our work. Okay, so let's go ahead, let's test our MCP server. Now, one thing that we will do is we'll head back to our API portal, click on settings, click on view API portal, then we'll need to log in. So now we can see that we've got our MCP server. So this is great. We can go ahead and click on it. And if we scroll down, we will see a copy link, copy URL for our MCP server. So let's click on that value, and we now need to go test this. Now, we will get to Copilot Studio, and but it's always kind of a good idea in my mind is to test your MCP server before you start sharing it with others. And one way you can go do this is with VS Code. So let's head over to VS Code, and we'll click on View Command Palette MCP Server Add MCP. And then we'll use HTTP, and then here's that URL that we got from the API portal. And then here we'll call this MCP, just because I have a few other Salesforce MCP servers. And here we will make this globally available. Now, so this is what's happened is we've got our MCP server set up here. Now it's asking me to go ahead and authenticate. So this is good because we set up OAuth, and so now it's going to prompt me for my corporate credentials in order to go ahead and authenticate and use this. Also notice we don't have any API keys or nothing here because we are using OAuth, and so we're doing this in a very secure manner. Now, one thing, I've paused while I've logged in, but one thing you'll see here is there's also this consent, right, where we're being asked for permissions to go ahead and connect to this MCP server, so I thought that would be interesting to show as well. Okay, so what we'll do here is let's go ahead and start this MCP server, and that we do see that it is running, so that's a good sign. And then also notice that there's 4 tools that have been discovered. So if you haven't used VS Code before in GitHub Copilot, this is kind of interesting. You want to make sure you're in agent mode, because there's a few different modes there. Model is kind of up to you. Here we'll just use GPT-5, but we could use the other models that are available. But this tools is interesting. So let's just go in here and just search for Salesforce, and we'll see that we've got the MCP workshop here. So we've got our 4 tools. Now, I don't want to sort of run into like ambiguous calls. So let's just deselect these other ones that are enabled because we don't want any sort of interference. Now, so what I'll do now is I'll just walk up to this agent and just say hi. And we won't go through all of the MCP tools because once again, we'll get to that once we go ahead and connect from Copilot Studio, and we'll kind of build out a full agent. But this will just at least do an initial kind of smoke test against the MCP server. Okay, so I'm just going to say get account for Contoso construction. And so our agent should be smart enough to say, hey, I've got this MCP tools, MCP server that offers tools and accounts to go ahead and retrieve. So it should be able to go ahead and grab this information for us. Okay, so it's basically about to call our MCP server. And you could see just some information, so we know it's on the right path, right? So we're in this particular MCP server, which is ours. This is the name of that workflow tool that will get us the account information. Now, this is where we typically go ahead and see any sort of inputs that need to be provided. Here, there's just some additional preamble that they're displaying here, but not overly too relevant. But we'll click the Allow button, and now we should go ahead and call that MCP server. And sure enough, it's gone ahead and retrieved that account information. Now, This is, I think, one of the value props for using Logic Apps is this notion of telemetry, right? And we can see exactly what just happened. So we're now back in the Logic app. We see the workflows, and we want to click on the Get Account Records from Salesforce, and then we can click on Run History. So if you've used Power Automate before, this will be quite familiar for you. And here we could see exactly the request that was made, the response that was retrieved from Salesforce and returned back to our agent. So at least at this point, we've done an initial test. We feel good that we've created a MCP server that we can go ahead and call in an authenticated manner and retrieve the information that we're interested in. Let's now shift gears here, and we're going to talk a bit about Microsoft Foundry. So if you're not familiar with Microsoft Foundry, it is a strategic platform for Microsoft. So we do see things obviously on the Copilot Studio side of things and the Office side of things, and then there's also, I would call, more on the Azure side of things, or maybe the quote-unquote pro developer side of things, and Microsoft Foundry typically sits over in that side of the sort of spectrum. And it does provide developers with a one-stop shop for building and managing agents. Now, agents aren't overly useful without connectivity, and this is where MCP servers become the best way to provide this connectivity. Now, we can leverage the 1,400 plus Logic App connectors that we just saw in API Center in a very similar manner. And so what we've done is we've built a similar experience where you can go into Foundry and you can create a tool, and you can search for a particular connector and then go ahead and configure that connector in order to build a solution. So let's go ahead and show this in action. And the steps that we're going to go ahead and perform, and I'll take you through them one by one, is we're going to create a Foundry project. We'll then access the tools in that catalog. We'll build our MCP server, and then we'll go ahead and test our MCP server. Now in this case, we're going to do that using a Foundry agent as opposed to using VS Code. But once again, just wanted to show you another way in which we can call our Logic Apps MCP servers. Now to get started with Microsoft Foundry, we do need to create an instance. So we'll head to the Azure portal, and this is where we can go ahead and create a resource. So this will just kind of follow our sort of traditional steps where we need to select a subscription resource group, etc. All right, so I've just filled in my details, and I can also go ahead and provide a project name, a default project name. So we will just go ahead and enable that. Okay, our resource is available and is now complete. Now, we from there want to go to the Foundry portal, so we'll just go ahead and click on that. Now, something to be aware of is that as of Ignite, there's kind of two sort of modes with Foundry because they're actively making some enhancements there. So we've got this notion of the old Foundry and new Foundry. For the stuff that we want to be doing, we want to make sure that we're in new Foundry. So just click this toggle here, and then we should be able to search for our default project that we just had created, so MCP Workshop. So then we can go ahead and click on Let's Go. Now, some interesting information just available right off the bat. Like, we do have a project endpoint, we have an API key. We won't be using that here, but sometimes you need that info, so that's available to you. Then you kind of want to look at these tabs at the top. So Home, Discover, Build, Operate, and Docs. Now, the area that we're interested in here is going to be Build, and this is where we can go ahead and do things like create an agent, and we can go ahead and establish tools. So we will come back to creating an agent. I think what we want to go ahead and start with is the tools conversation. So let's go ahead and click on tools, and then we can go ahead and connect a tool. Now, Foundry is interesting in the sense that there's a lot going on, right? So they've got a bunch of first-party and third-party integration around tools and some pre-configured options here. Like you can see Fabric, browser automation, that's that computer usage stuff. And then they've got SharePoint. Now, where we want to head over to is we want to head over to catalog. And once again, there's going to be a lot of different options inside of here. We've got things that are related to Logic Apps. We have things that are not related to Logic App. For example, when you see things like MCP Local, that means like they've gone ahead and built some sort of integration with it. We also have situations where some vendors provide their own MCP servers. So Box would be one of them, and that just becomes available as part of this platform. So this is more than just Logic Apps. This can be much more. Now, what's also kind of interesting, we talked about API Center before, and we can actually plug into those registries here as well. So we might have our API Center instance that we want to connect Foundry to and can go ahead and do that. Now, what I had created before is in a different tenant, so we don't see that listed here, but that is an option. We could just also select on Logic App connectors, or just another way to go ahead and address this is to just search for the connector that you're interested in. Now, I'm going to go ahead and build some tools with ServiceNow, and so that's where we'll go ahead and select ServiceNow, and this is going to be that Logic App connector. Now, what is also interesting is, and this is where it's a little different than what we saw with API Center. API Center, we had an existing Logic app that was already available for us that we could go ahead and use. Here, to help customers get started, we offer a limited Logic Apps instance that you can use for Foundry. So here we can go ahead and create this. There's no cost for the compute and the memory, the storage for now. And there is still a sort of a small transaction for the connector usage. So that's kind of like a fraction of a penny every time you call it. So nothing too substantial. So here I'm going to call this MCP Workshop LA, and then I'm Foundry, just so I know it's Foundry. And we'll go ahead and create this resource. So this will take just a minute or two, so I'll pause the recording. All right, so our resource was automatically created, and we get redirected to this experience. Now, this should look familiar, and it is for good reason. This is a shared experience between the API Center stuff that you saw previously and now Microsoft Foundry. Now, because we selected our connector first, we know what operations we want to go ahead and provide here. So these would be the connector operations for ServiceNow if we wanted to build an ITSM tool. So let's go ahead. We want to be able to create an incident for sure, and then I think it probably makes sense to list records. So list incidents, so we'll also go ahead and select that as well. We could do update, but won't sort of go too deep here. Once again, we need to go ahead and create a connection, so I will go ahead and do that. So I've got this information in place. Okay, so our connection's there. We'll hit save. And now there's still things we want to go ahead and provide here. So we do need to provide an MCP server name. Because what is actually kind of interesting is that we can run this wizard multiple times and leverage the same Logic app but have multiple MCP servers. And that becomes particularly useful when you have you want some isolation or separation between your MCP servers. So let's go ahead and populate this info. Okay, so I've provided an MCP server name and a description. Now we do want to go ahead and do some configuration here. So much like we saw with Salesforce, we want to make some updates. The first would be the description. Okay, so we want to update it so that it's specific to creating an IT incident, because remember, we've got to create record. This is a very generic operation because ServiceNow has hundreds of tables, it looks like, and we want to be very focused on dealing with incidents, and so that's why we want to pre-configure this so that we don't have a large language model that's doing a lot of guessing. That wouldn't end well. The other thing we want to do now is to select a few different properties that we want to include. So severity is always a good one. Short description is another one. Obviously, you can go ahead and add more as you see fit as well. These will be provided by the model. Now, even though this list record says configured, I like it. I think it's a good practice just to go ahead and do those updates here as well. And same thing with the model. Like if we don't, like right now, what's going to happen is the agent will try to guess what table we're interested in. Since we know that we want to focus on incidents, let's change this to be user provided and then just be more explicit about the fact that we want to return incidents. I think that's just a better way to go. Another thing that you may want to also do is, you could query, so you could provide the opportunity to query for a specific ticket number, or you might want to limit like the number of values that are returned, right? And so this is where you might want to just like limit your return set to maybe 15 items, because we may not want to use or abuse a whole bunch of tokens. Same thing with fields. If there's fields that are being returned that we're just not interested in, they're just going to burn up tokens, we can restrict that so that this is more optimized. Now let's go ahead, we're ready to register, and so we can go ahead and do that right now. Now one tip is that if you run through this, you might get prompted for a pop-up block. So look for that icon here in this top right hand corner, because you should be redirected back here. If you're not redirected back here, you probably have a pop-up block, and so you want to make sure that that is enabled. Because we're now back inside of Foundry, we go to tools and we can see this information. So we've got those two tools that belong to this particular MCP server. We have an endpoint, and then what's happened here is the authentication's been a little different. Because this is starting from Foundry, what's happened is that there's been managed identity and security configuration taken place for you, so that this particular project can go ahead and call that Logic app without any additional security being required. So this will be a little bit different than what we see with Copilot Studio. Okay, so our MCP server is available. Now, what do we do with it, right? So we want to use an agent. And since we don't have any agents here, what we'll do is we'll create one. So we'll just call this MCP Workshop, and we'll call it ITSM. All right, so now we get redirected over to the agent experience. So you can see here we're in agents. And we've got some models that have been deployed and are available for us. Let's just go ahead and let's try this. I can't imagine this not working, but obviously you can kind of deploy additional models as you see fit. Now we do need to provide a prompt here. So let's go ahead and do so. Okay, so you're an IT service management agent that can help with listing and creating IT incidents, right? So that sounds pretty good. Now, if we go ahead and run this, we can't do anything just yet because we don't have the tool. Now, the way that I've found, maybe there's other ways of doing this, but what I've found works quite well is if you go back to tools and then you select use an agent and then select the agent that we just created, that will automatically create that linkage. Maybe there's another way, but at least that's what I've found. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and say list IT incidents. This will now go ahead and connect to ServiceNow through our Logic app and use that connector in order to go ahead and retrieve those incidents. Now we can also go ahead and say create incident, and because our Logic app trigger knows that we have inputs required like short description and severity, then it's going to ask us for this. So I'm just going to say Wi-Fi not working, and this is a 1 for critical. And so here this will go ahead and call out to that Logic app and go ahead and make those calls. So this is just a sort of a quick demo just to show you. I know the focus here is more about Copilot Studio, but just wanted to show how when you build these Logic app experiences, they're available from multiple locations. That's the whole sort of idea of the open protocol of MCP. Okay, so let's just do a bit of a recap here. So we've seen from API Center and from Microsoft Foundry that we can go through a wizard and create these very simple workflows, but they're pre-configured based upon our input parameters that we require. And we kind of wire this all up, and it actually works quite well and it's quite smooth, and you can really build an MCP server in a matter of minutes. Now the question becomes, okay, well, what's going on under the hood? Like sometimes people, they want to be able to make some configurations, some customizations, or know how things work. That's what this section is designed to go ahead and provide. So we expose MCP servers through Logic Apps. Now, how do we do that under the hood? And so that's what I'm going to show you here. We've got a file called host.json where we can configure this, and we do this for you when you run the wizard. But you could also do these things manually if you really wanted to, because maybe you've got existing Logic apps and workflows that you want to expose but don't want to go through and republish. Now, there is a prerequisite for a workflow to be eligible to become an MCP tool, and it is that trigger needs to be an HTTP request, and we also need to see a corresponding HTTP response. And so that's something that is required for a workflow. And that's why those workflows look the same that we saw previously, where there's a request, a particular action, and then a response, because that would align with the requirements here as well. Now, we're going to see here in more detail like the easy auth authentication and how that works. And this also might be another use case where maybe you've got more complex scenarios where you want to mix and match multiple connectors, and you want to be able to do that inside of a single tool. Or maybe you want to call a built-in connector or some custom code. These would be other options or avenues that you can go ahead and leverage. And one thing I would also suggest is like you can also start with the wizard and just get it to provision a generic Logic App workflow, and then go ahead and tweak it and update it. And that's completely acceptable, and probably one of the easier ways to get started with more complex use cases where you want more than just say a simple email action or something like that. So what we have done, if we take a look under the hood, is we do have a layer that sits on top of the Logic Apps workflow. It's not one of those things where we had to go ahead and redesign Logic Apps to actually support this, but instead just layer on this MCP layer on top that leverages existing security constructs like OAuth and key-based authentication, so that you can go ahead and sort of don't have to learn a bunch of new stuff in order to get this working. Now, just some forward guidance here is we are working on a user experience that makes this more visual. And so a lot of the things I'm going to show you in this segment, aren't necessarily things you have to know, but I just know some of you folks like this level of details. And so we have introduced something called groupings that allow you to host multiple MCP servers in a single Logic app. So this allows you to reuse that compute that you're paying for and have unique URLs for those different groupings, because let's be honest, there might be some agents that don't need access to some of these other capabilities, and that allows you to go ahead and separate them because you've got unique URLs and endpoints. Now, the one thing that is shared, though, the compute remains shared, the storage remains shared, and also the security remains shared as well, but you do have those unique endpoints. So let's go ahead, let's see this demo in action and go deeper underneath the hood. Okay, so let's go ahead, let's do a deep dive into the Logic App configuration. Now we're in the Logic App that we previously updated when we were using API Center. Now, we did show a little bit of this, but there was one other piece that I wanted to mention as well. So within a workflow, if we have a HTTP request trigger, a corresponding HTTP response action, that workflow becomes eligible to be an MCP tool. Now, as we've kind of alluded to a few times, that tool descriptions are pretty important because it gives the agent and the LLM the ability to understand what the tool is capable of doing, and naturally when it comes to execution, that becomes important information. So one other piece that I didn't mention before is that we have this notes feature here, and you can go ahead and access this from within a trigger. So just select a trigger and you can see it here. This was the description that we updated in API Center. And as a result, that gets pushed through to this workflow as we go through that wizard. So this looks good, but if we were creating our own MCP tools, our own workflows, we would also want to update this value too. Now, I talked a little bit about how there's some configurations, like we've layered on the MCP server capabilities on top of Logic Apps and our workflow engine. So we want to head back, and there's kind of a few things I want to show you. Now, these are, you don't really need to know these. I'm just kind of going into more details, just providing a deep dive. You shouldn't need to go in and modify these. but just for awareness. So what we've got is in Advanced Tools and then Go, we have a tool called Kudo. And this actually gives us access to the underlying file system for our Logic app that's running. So we can click on Debug Console and then followed by CMD. And then what we're able to do is navigate the file system. So we'll click on Site, www root, and then we've got some configuration files here. The first one we're going to go ahead and explore is called host.json. So this ultimately controls a lot of the behavior of your Logic app. And this is oftentimes where we might include temporary feature flags or stuff like that. Now, one such thing that we've enabled is MCP server endpoints. So through the wizards, when we talk about both API Center and the Foundry Tools catalog, is when we go ahead and register that MCP server, we actually go ahead and add this configuration, and this actually enables that MCP layer for your specific Logic app. So that's something that is here for us. Now, by default, when we're enabling these MCP servers, we will enable API key and OAuth security configurations. Now, you can override that. You can also do anonymous if you want. And we do have some documentation that describes how you can go ahead and do that. Now, the other configuration I wanted to share with you is this MCP servers.json file. So we can go ahead and edit that file. And here we're going to see some familiar properties, right? These were properties that were set during our wizard. So if we go back to the API Center, we were talking about Salesforce, and we gave the name for our MCP server of MCP Workshop Salesforce. We also see the description. That was the description that we provided in that experience. And then we see the tools. And these tools match up with our specific workflows. Now, also note here that this is an array. We've got an array of MCP servers. So what this allows us to do is actually to have multiple MCP servers in this single Logic app. And this would allow you to go ahead and run those wizards multiple times. And what will happen is you would see a new node show up for each MCP server that you actually registered itself. Now, moving forward, we're not expecting people to come in to like modify these values or even sort of view these values. We are working on some configuration inside of the Logic app itself. You'll see an entry here on our table of contents that will allow you to go ahead and manage your MCP server. So the ability to see your URLs, to be able to manage your groups, to be able to remove workflows, add workflows into your existing groups without always having to rerun that wizard if you don't want to. So that is something to go ahead and look for in the near future. But for now, just wanted to explain how this actually works under the hood.
All right, let's now shift gears once again, and we're going to talk more specifically about Copilot Studio. So you can kind of think of all of the stuff that we've talked about before as almost like these prerequisites and base knowledge, and now it's about, hey, how do I go ahead and apply this to the area I'm familiar with in Copilot Studio, where you may be building a lot of your solutions. So Copilot Studio has this notion of tools, like it's not something unique. I think the difference is MCP becomes a type of tool, right? So existing tools that we have today include prompts that can apply AI to text, documents, or images. We do have the notion of agent flows that allow you to build those deterministic workflows, kind of similar to what we've seen with some of the Logic app workflows itself. We've got computer use, which is pretty interesting, right? So the ability to go ahead and interact with both web and desktop applications in order to accomplish a specific goal or task. We've got connectors, right? A lot of those same 1,400 connectors are available to us inside of Copilot Studio. We do have REST APIs. It could be custom connectors or just REST APIs we want to call. And then we've got the Model Context Protocol, which obviously leverages the open standard for connecting your agent to data itself. And so one of the questions you might have is like, okay, well, if I've got like all of these capabilities, do I really need MCP, or what's the value add? And I think when we talk about MCP, it kind of comes down to some of the same things that we were already talking about, right? Where unifying that connectivity across your enterprise, like building those standard pathways to your business data so that you can reuse it. It also helps other builders or makers that are building agents in Copilot Studio not have to think about those things, especially if there might be some sort of sanctioned way of doing it and you can basically publish it and then reuse it. It's a win-win for everyone. And sometimes those requirements might come from the enterprise needs, right? So you might need that VNet support to a particular API or a particular system, and you want to build that pathway once and then reuse it many times. Maybe you do have custom code that you want to go ahead and call. Maybe you do have additional needs around security constructs like managed identity. Oh, we've got data that's in, say, blob storage, but we're not going to open up that blob storage to the public internet. We're going to only expose that to a VNet. Well, how do I bridge from Copilot Studio to that VNet? Well, Logic Apps is one way of doing that in a quite reasonable way. And then last, we've touched on governance a few times here, but you want to reuse, you want to know what's being built. Putting things into MCP servers so an administrator can see them and manage them is just a good practice, and also just allows you to avoid impose or implement separations of concerns. Like there might be some functionality that you want to sort of bundle in an MCP server, and you don't want to have this massive catalog where your agents start to get confused because there's ambiguity in some of the tool calling. Well, you can segregate those into these groups and then be able to manage them in a more effective manner as well. So let's start to put things together here. And what we're going to do with Copilot Studio is we're going to build that sales management agent that I talked about before. Now, this content here isn't about creating the greatest agent inside of Copilot Studio. Here, I'm really focused on the MCP connectivity, and so we're going to sort of take that angle. Our agent's going to be actually quite simple from that perspective. So we're going to go ahead and create an agent. There's something that we need to do with our MCP server app registration. So this has to do with the first solution where we went through API Center and we built that MCP server, and it did create an app registration for us, but we do need to go ahead and update it to create a secret, because secrets are something that we can use as part of our authentication scheme from Copilot Studio. We'll then go ahead and connect our MCP server to Copilot Studio, and then we will test our MCP server in Copilot Studio. Now, we're going to talk a little bit after about how we can also use some of the out-of-box MCP servers that also exist inside of Copilot Studio. So you don't always have to go do this with Logic Apps necessarily. I think there's some good use cases where you want to do that. Salesforce is a great one. But there's going to be other use cases where out of the box, there's an MCP server already available to us in Copilot Studio. So we should just use that. And I'm going to show you, in this case, we're going to use Office 365 users and that MCP server, but there's a handful or a couple handful of options there for different out-of-box MCP servers that we can leverage. So let's go ahead, let's dive into a demo, and let's see how this all works. All right, so let's head over to Copilot Studio, and here we'll go ahead and start by creating a new agent. So with the desired environment selected, go ahead and click on Agents, and then go ahead and click on Blank Agent. We'll start there. All right, let's start by editing our agent here. Okay, so we'll start with the top and we'll hit Edit, and then let's go ahead and provide a name. Now we'll call this CPS Agent. And then for our description, we'll just keep this rather simple and just say that this is going to be a sales management capability. So let's go ahead, let's hit save so that we have kind of the base info sorted out here. Okay, and let's see here. So we'll stick with the 4.1, the GPT-4.1 agent, model. That makes sense. We're not going to have any sort of trigger here because this is going to be a conversational agent. So what we can do is just skip that part, and then we'll go to instructions. And so here we'll provide instructions on what we want our agent to do. Okay, so you are a sales management agent who is responsible for managing sales leads, opportunities, contacts, and accounts. You will also have the ability to book meetings with customers. So we are going to add that capability once we add the Logic Apps functionality, but we'll just do this all in one shot so that we've got our instructions up to date. Okay, so that's now saved. For our use case, we won't bother with knowledge, although that's a great feature, but for now, we won't worry about that. Next up, we are ready to deal with tools. Now, we can click on Add Tool, and this is where we start to see those various tools that we were talking about in the slides, right? So you do have connectors you can use, you have workflows or agent flows that you can go ahead and use, and then you also have Model Context Protocol. Now, here's where we get some of those out-of-box capabilities, those out-of-box MCP servers, and we'll go ahead and use one of these a little bit later, but the meeting management one in particular. But for now, what we do want to deal with is we want to click on the new tool and then Model Context Protocol. And this is where we're going to need a series of inputs to help us create this connection. So now is a good time where you'd want to go ahead and grab a notepad because there's a series of values that we need to go ahead and retrieve in order to make this successful. What we do need to do is we need to head back over to API Portal first because API Portal is going to give us our URL. We need to start with our URL. Okay, so we're in API Center once again. We want to go down to API Center Portal, click on Settings. Then we'll go ahead and click on View API Center Portal, and then we'll need to go ahead and log in. So we'll log in, and we will find our MCP Workshop Salesforce, and then we will come down here and grab the URL, right? So the endpoint URL, go ahead and copy that, and then paste it into Notepad or the tool of your choice. Okay, great. Now the next place we need to go to is App Registrations. Inside of Azure Portal, you click on App Registrations, and you can go to either to owned applications or all applications. And here we should see that we have this particular app registration. So this was the one that gets created from API Center and is used inside of the Logic Apps authentication configuration. And this is the one that's going to be of interest for us. Now, there's a few values that we're going to need here, and so unfortunately, I'm going to have to blur these out. These are going to be unique to me, but we do need the application client ID, and we also need the tenant or the directory ID. All right, so go ahead and copy those values. Now, one thing that doesn't take place, even though this app registration's been created for us, we don't have a secret. And we don't need one when we go ahead and use it from like Logic Apps with the Easy Auth because we're using OAuth authentication. So you've got an end user that's typically authenticating with it. Here, what's happening is that Copilot Studio does require the secret or a certificate. And in this case, we're going to use a secret. So let's go ahead and click on New Client Secret. We'll provide a description and an expiration date. I'm going to pause here just so that my secret doesn't accidentally get leaked. But this is a value you're also going to want to go ahead and copy. All right, so we have a secret in place. Now, the next area we want to go to is expose an API. And here we have basically, this is already set up for us. We have a scope. We're going to need this value as well. So just go ahead and copy this to the clipboard because we will need this a little bit later. Now, don't go ahead and close this dialog just yet because we are going to need to come back here in a little bit and we're going to click on this authentication tab and we are going to go ahead and add a redirect URI, but we don't have it yet, but we will get one from Copilot Studio. So go ahead and just leave this tab open and we will be back. Okay, so back to Copilot Studio, and we are going to need to provide a name. So here we're just going to call this MCP Workshop, and then we will add a dash, and then we will say Salesforce. You do need to keep this to less than 30 characters, so just be aware of that. And then this one, server description, we're going to say this is a sales management MCP server. And then this is where we're going to go ahead and paste in our URL that we obtained from the API portal that we were just in. So we're going to go ahead and paste that. And then what we need to do is go ahead and select OAuth 2 here. Now, what we're going to do here is we're going to use manual, and this will go ahead and help us configure all of these values. So we need our client ID and our client secret that we just obtained from the app registration. So I'm just going to pause once again. Okay, so that those values are inputted. Now, their authorization URL. So what this is going to look like is we've got the tail end here. We've got, it ends in OAuth2/v2.0/authorize. This is my tenant ID, which is going to be blurred out. And if we go to the front, we're going to see that we've got login.microsoftonline.com. And so once again, this is my tenant ID that we would need to go ahead and obtain. And that's going to also come from that screen in the app registration where we had the directory/tenant ID. Now, the token URL template and the refresh URL are exactly the same. And so what's going to happen is we've got similar construct here, login.microsoftonline.com. If we go to the end, we will see that it's OAuth2/v2.0/token, and that should be exactly the same for both of these. Now, the scopes, that's where we need, that was from that other screen, that expose API. And so this is where we'll go ahead and enter in this value. Once again, I've sort of blurred out my GUID. You will want to make sure that you have your own. It does end in /user_impersonation, and it starts with API://. Now, here's where I'm going to hit the create button, and if everything goes well, we are going to have a redirect URL that we're going to want to copy. This is the value that we need to go back to the app registration and update it. All right, so that takes a few seconds, but success. So let's go ahead, let's copy this value, and let's put this in a safe place. And then what we can do is click on next to go ahead and add the tool. Actually, maybe just in case, let's head back and just update the app registration first. So let's just head back there. So once again, back in that app registration, we're going to add a redirect URI. And in this case, it'll just be web. And we will just go ahead and paste in this value and then just use the defaults and just click configure. And this will now be added to our configuration. All right, back to Copilot Studio. Then let's hit next. And now we can go ahead and create a new connection. So this should connect. This is why we wanted to update that app registration so that we can, redirect back to the right location. So that's why we wanted to do that. Our connection is now established, so we can go ahead and click on add and configure. And so this will add our MCP server to our agent. Now, if we scroll down a little bit, we're going to see some additional information, but we can see that we've got our tools are all in place, and we do have these tools enabled. So things look pretty good. At this point, we're ready to go ahead and we can start testing and just make sure that this all works for us. Okay, so we won't do the whole test just yet, but what we will, just to make sure this is working, let's just ask for details about the Contoso construction account. All right, looks pretty good. We've got the specific details for Contoso, and looks like our MCP server is working. So that's great. Okay, so we can see here that we've got our MCP server working. Now,
you might be wondering, okay, so here we're calling basically a custom MCP server. Now, when we were in that add a tool experience previously, and we clicked on Model Context Protocol, we saw other options show up here. And so what are these? And so these are generally provided out of the box. Now, some of these are custom connectors too. Under the hood, like what we've just created actually is a custom connector on the Power Platform. That's how it sort of bridges that connectivity. But these other ones are, most of these anyways, are considered what we call out of box. Now here, if you think about the Office 365 Outlook connector, that has a lot of different operations, right? That allows you to get like free busy time on a calendar. That allows you to manage contacts. That allows you to send emails, create drafts, all those things. And then here we can see that they've separated it out into multiple MCP servers. And they've done this for good reason. And I would look at this kind of similar to why we have custom MCP servers, is that you might want to have that separation of concerns where you are basically breaking apart functionality and then grouping them into their functional areas so that they kind of, make most sense. And now the question becomes, okay, when do I want to use these versus, using a connector or using an MCP server? And I would say in general, you should use these first if you can, because these are going to be very specific and it's going to be the least amount of work for you and the least amount of maintenance for you to go ahead and maintain these things. When possible. Now, there might be some situations where, you don't want to go do that and you want to enrich it, customize it, do your own grouping, and, that's completely valid to go do that. Now, unfortunately, I don't have an email account associated with this user, so I can't show you the Office ones, which would make a lot of sense to go, say, book a meeting or send an email, but I can go ahead and use this M365 user profile just to kind of show you this experience, because I think it's still worthwhile going through this. So you go ahead and you create a new connection, and all this is going to do is basically prompt you to log in, and you'll use the logged in credentials of your user, and it'll establish a connection much like it does today when using Power Platform connectors. So we can now go ahead and add and configure, and we'll go ahead and add that to our agent itself. Now, one of, I'd say maybe the downsides of this, but it is manageable, so it's not a huge downside, is that we can actually go ahead and turn on or off different tools. Now, by default, all of the tools are enabled, but we can selectively turn which ones that we don't want to be available. We can turn them off. So, for example, like let's say we didn't want to enable Get My Manager. Now we can go ahead and disable that. So that tool doesn't belong or isn't accessible for my agent. And this would be, I guess, maybe one of the arguments for when you're building your own custom MCP servers is you can include exactly what you want and what you don't want. Now here, it's a reasonable experience to just disable, turn something on, turn something off, and then go ahead and click save. And, that's as simple as it is, but it is something that you go ahead and manage. So what we can go ahead now and do is say get my user profile. And this will now call that MCP server. It is asking for consent here because it uses something similar to on behalf of on the Logic Apps side that we talked about earlier today. And so this is going to run underneath this security context. So here, that is calling out to that MCP server. It's going to go grab that information and bring it back to the agent. So that is also something just to be aware of, is that these other MCP servers do exist. Now, I would say they're not all made equally. One thing I would say is if we go back and we take a look at like the Salesforce one. So we built our own Salesforce tool. But their Salesforce MCP server isn't as advanced, I would say. Like, it's not going to have the same level of operations and that same level of granularity. And part of the reason for this is because we've gone through that configuration experience where we go ahead and choose the entity that we want to interact with. That's something that doesn't exist on the MCP server for Salesforce. It's going to ask you to go ahead and provide basically their query language. It's not a bad tool for being able to go ahead and query data from Salesforce, but I would argue it's not a great tool for creating data, because this is not something that you can configure, right? This is something where you might be able to provide a query, but it's not the same as calling a REST API. And that's why it's kind of important to kind of think of the glue or this configuration that is available to us by going through that wizard, selecting the different properties, selecting whether we want the data to be provided by a user or a model in order to populate a specific request. And so that's something that is to be aware of. I think the other Microsoft ones around email and calendar, those make perfect sense to go use those out of the box. But, things like some of these SaaS connectors, especially like Salesforce, that would be an argument to go ahead and just use the connector or package it up as in a custom MCP server as we've shown today in this workshop, and then be able to go ahead and call it. All right, so let's just kind of finish off the demo. We didn't go the full distance here with the Salesforce, so let's just go ahead and complete all of this last mile. All right, so the scenario is that we have an account, and this account is Contoso Construction. They're an important customer for our coffee business. And what's happened is that they have a new manager that has joined the organization. And we do want to go ahead and meet with this person. We'll call him Steve Smith. And Steve, we feel, hopefully can influence a deal. And we have an upcoming deal that we want to close. And we want to use our MCP server and our agent here to help us go through this particular process. All right, so we're going to start by asking, what's the account information for Contoso Construction? All right, so this is cool. We've got the information here. And now what we want to go ahead and do is that we want to create a contact. Because we've had a meeting with Steve, we feel like the opportunity is in pretty good shape. So let's go ahead and add a contact. All right, so we've added Steve Smith. We probably could have added the email and city, etc., but here we are. Now, what's the scenario is we have opportunities for Contoso Construction. All right, so we can see here we've got this opportunity here. All right, so we'll leave the demo there. And let's head back to the slide.
Looks like Jimmy's getting me to wrap up, and I wanted to leave you with some resources before I go ahead and do so. And first off, I do want to just thank you very much for joining. I appreciate your attendance, and feel free to provide any sort of comments or feedback. Please do like, subscribe, and share this with people who could benefit from it. Now, some additional resources that I want to leave you with. If you want to refer back to a blog post where we talk about Logic Apps MCP Servers, please go ahead and check out that link. Then also demos, right? So I've got some additional use cases, demos, things like SharePoint and Dataverse. So those might be of interest to you as well. So go ahead and check those out. Now, looking for additional content, maybe you're on my YouTube channel already, but this is where I will go ahead and post content. And then also I've come up with a personal blog called theagentfrontier.com where I talk all things agent, particularly Microsoft related tech, and you can go ahead and check that out there. So once again, thank you very much for joining. A like, subscribes, comments, welcome, and we'll see you again soon. Take care.